When night falls, not everything goes to sleep. Some secrets awaken, and some forgotten stories begin to whisper. If you are brave enough to listen, join me, the Dark Hour Pan, to explore what lurks in the shadows. The Final Sonata, a letter from Montfort. The rain fell unevenly, at times a patter, at times a scream like a madman outside the window. For Adrien Valois, it was the only music Paris had offered him for the past month. He sat silently before the old piano, its keys yellowed like ivory, still as a tombstone. His stomach was hollow, and the last few coins on his table seemed to mock him. The sonata written for his father, a piece filled with pain and hope, lay on the music stand, crossed out in red ink by an unknown publisher. Too melancholic, they had said, not to the public's taste. Taste. Adrien curled his lip in a bitter smile. The taste of Paris was now for cheerful waltzes, frivolous melodies for the balls of the nobility, those who had never known hunger. Knock, knock. A dry, impatient knock echoed. Adrien started. Madame Lemoine, the landlady. It had to be. Valois, a letter for you. Her sharp voice pierced through the thin wood. Bring the rent down now if you don't want your sheet music to kindle tonight's fire. Adrien sighed, wearily dragging himself to the door. He had no money, but a letter was a worthy distraction at this point. He opened the door to face the landlady's perpetually sour expression. She shoved an envelope into his hand and then held out her wrinkled palm. A letter from some gentleman, she grumbled. Looks quite fancy. You've been borrowing money again, haven't you? Adrien silently handed her his last coins. Madame Lemoine counted them over and over, clicked her tongue, and then turned away, the clatter of her wooden clogs on the stairs sounding like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. Adrien closed the door, returning to his cold room. He looked at the letter. Madame Lemoine was right. It was entirely different from his squalid world. Thick, cream-colored parchment, its edges uncreased. In the center was a jet-black wax seal, imprinted with the image of a raven holding its head high with pride. The smell of old paper, beeswax, and a strange musty scent like damp earth after a rain emanated from it. His hand trembled slightly as he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a sheet of paper with beautiful handwriting, the letters slanted and sharp as talons. To Monsieur Valois, I write these lines having heard of your exceptional talent, a talent buried by the short-sightedness of the age. My name is Count Alaric de Montfort. I have a proposal. I have spent my life composing a symphony, a masterpiece that I believe will stand the test of time. Its name is Lacrimosa Immortalis. However, the frailties of old age do not permit me to set down its final note. I require someone who can understand the soul of the music and complete it. Come to the Montfort estate. I will pay you 500 gold livres upon the work's completion. All travel and living expenses will be provided for. A carriage will await you at the Golden Lion Inn on the outskirts of Paris in 3 days' time. Sincerely, Count Alaric de Montfort. Adrien had to read the letter 3 times. 500 gold livres. The sum was absurd. It was enough for him to live comfortably for 10 years, enough to buy a new piano, enough to print and publish all of his works. him, an unknown, destitute musician. And the name of the music, Immortal Tears, it evoked a feeling both tragic and bizarre. A flicker of doubt crept into his mind, a cold sensation like a finger tracing down his spine. But then he looked around his room. The cold, the hunger, and the despair. This offer, however insane, was his only lifeline. He clenched the letter in his hand, the parchment crinkling against his palm. He would go, whatever the cost. The carriage sent by Count Alaric arrived as promised. It was strangely luxurious, with a glossy black finish, a worn red velvet interior, and no family crest. The driver was a taciturn old man, his face as if carved from stone, who spoke only one sentence upon meeting Adrien. "Monsieur Valois, get in." During the first few hours of the journey, Adrien still felt elated. He had escaped Paris, escaped the hunger and the scorn. He imagined a magnificent estate, an old art-loving count, and the bright future that 500 gold livres would bring. He watched the golden wheat fields and peaceful little villages glide past the window. But as the day wore on, the scenery began to change. The fertile fields gave way to dense forests, with gaunt trees whose bare branches reached up to the gray sky like bony arms. The villages grew scarcer, the houses more dilapidated, and there seemed to be no people. The road worsened, the wheels constantly jolting over potholes, creating an unpleasant noise. The silence inside the carriage became heavy, broken only by the steady beat of horse hooves and the creaking of the coach. Adrien tried to look out the window, but all he saw were the monotonous and menacing tree trunks flashing by like prison bars. Unable to bear the silence, Adrien leaned forward and tapped lightly on the partition. "How much further, sir?" After a long moment, a small window slid open, revealing the coachman's beady eyes. His gaze swept over Adrien, full of suspicion. "We're approaching the Count's lands now," he replied, his voice as hoarse as gravel. "His lands must be vast," Adrien tried to make conversation. "You must have served the Count for many years?" The old man was silent for a long while, so long that Adrien thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped to a near whisper, and his eyes darted outside as if he feared being overheard. "Serve the Count?" He let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "No one in these parts works for Count Montfort, young man. We only take contracts to carry goods to the foot of the hill, and never after sunset." "Why is that?" Adrien asked, curious. The coachman leaned closer, his breath carrying the smell of cheap wine and old fear. "Because they say that those who enter the Montfort estate never come out. You're not the first one I've brought here. Before you, there was a painter from Florence, an alchemist from Prague, and even a violinist from Vienna. They were all talented people, and they all received generous offers, just like you." He paused, licking his dry lips. "No one ever saw them return. But sometimes people find their belongings. A paintbrush lying in the middle of the forest, spotlessly clean. One of the violinist's shoes placed neatly on a rock by a stream, as if she had just taken it off to rest. No sign of a struggle. They just vanish into thin air." Adrien felt a chill run down his spine. The coachman continued, his voice growing softer and more urgent. And on nights with a full moon, when the wind blows down from the hill, the villagers hear strange sounds. Not the howling of wolves, but music. Music? Adrien repeated, his heart beginning to pound. Aye, the old man affirmed, his eyes wide. But a sick, wrong kind of music. Melodies that sound like weeping, like muffled screams. Some even swear they hear their own names being called on the wind. With that, he drew back, his eyes filled with pity for Adrien. Listen, boy, the Count's offer may be worth its weight in gold, but your freedom is worth more. Turn back before it's too late. That estate doesn't just take your life. They say it takes your talent, takes your very soul, and turns your music into its own mournful echo. Without waiting for Adrien's reaction, the old man slammed the window shut with a decisive thud. Adrien sat stunned in the darkness of the carriage. The warning was no longer vague. It was detailed, vivid, and nightmarish. The image of the clean paintbrush, the solitary shoe, and the ghostly music echoed in his mind. The carriage continued to roll forward, each turn of the wheel now sounding like a step bringing him closer to hell. A true sense of unease began to consume Adrien. The coachman's words, the desolation of the landscape, all seemed to confirm his initial vague suspicions. He looked outside. Dusk was falling. Fog began to rise from the valleys, thick as milk, swallowing everything in its path. The carriage now felt like a ghost ship adrift on a white ocean. After nearly an hour immersed in the fog, the carriage suddenly slowed and came to a stop. Adrien heard the coachman mutter something that sounded like a prayer before he opened the carriage door. "We're here," he said, his voice unable to hide his eagerness to leave. "I'll leave your luggage here. Just follow this path straight to the gate." Adrien stepped out. The cold, damp air hit his face. He stood before an old stone path, flanked by 2 rows of ancient cypress trees that stood like silent sentinels. At the end of the path, looming in the mist, was the silhouette of the Montfort estate. It was not as he had imagined. It was not magnificent. It was immense, and it exuded an air of menace. Sharp spires pierced the sky like blackened fingers. The stone walls were covered in moss, and the dark windows were like empty eye sockets. The estate stood alone on the hilltop, completely isolated from the world. Behind him, the crack of a whip and the sound of wheels hastily rolling away faded into the mist. Adrien was left alone, facing the path to the ghostly castle, with only the howling wind through the leaves for company. He swallowed hard, clutched the leather satchel containing his manuscripts, and took a step forward. Each of Adrien's steps on the moss-covered stone path made a solitary crunch, a tiny, lost sound in the overwhelming silence. The silence here was unnatural. It was not the peace of the countryside. There were no chirping insects, no bird calls, not even the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth. There was only the sound of the wind howling through the spires of the estate, which sounded like someone moaning. The closer he got, the more immense and towering the castle appeared. It was like a giant stone monster sleeping in the mist. Adrien looked up at the gargoyles clinging to the arches. In the faint twilight, they looked like grinning demons, their stone eyes seeming to follow his every move. Finally, he stood before the main door. It was a massive double door of black oak, reinforced with large iron bands and rusted studs. In the center, instead of a normal handle, was a bronze door knocker, intricately sculpted into the shape of a raven, identical to the one on the wax seal. Its head was held high, and its sharp beak nearly touched the wood. Adrien took a deep breath, the freezing air filling his lungs. His hand trembled as he reached out, his fingers just brushing the cold metal when... Screech! A piercing, prolonged sound echoed. It wasn't from the knocker. It was from the door itself. It was moving on its own. Slowly, heavily, one of the massive doors swung inward, opening a path into the deep darkness. Not a single person, not a single torch. Only a blast of cold air, carrying the scent of dust and the dampness of centuries, rushed out to greet him. For a moment, Adrien wanted to turn and run. The coachman's warning, the deathly silence, the self-opening door, it all screamed danger. But then the image of his squalid attic and his last coins returned. The pride of an artist would not allow him to retreat from a little mystery. He tightened his grip on his satchel, lifted his head high, and stepped over the threshold. As soon as he was inside, the door slammed shut behind him with a resounding boom, trapping him in darkness. Adrien's heart felt like it would leap from his chest. He stood motionless, his eyes trying to adjust to the night. Then, from a distance, a light flickered on, then another. One by one, the candles on giant iron candelabras along the grand hall ignited themselves, banishing the darkness and revealing the scene within. It was a magnificent but desolate hall. The floor was of polished black marble, reflecting the flickering candlelight like a still lake. Enormous embroidered tapestries hung on the walls, their colors faded, depicting hunts and battles from a forgotten age. A few suits of old knight's armor stood silently in alcoves, still and covered in dust like iron tombs. The air was thick and heavy. "Welcome to Montfort, Monsieur Valois." The voice came from the far end of the hall, a deep, smooth voice, as melodious as a cello, yet carrying no warmth whatsoever. Adrien started and turned. Standing there, next to a colossal, unlit stone fireplace, was a man. He seemed to have been standing there for a very long time, as silent as a statue. It was undoubtedly Count Alaric. He was tall and thin, dressed in an all-black noble's attire. His silver-white hair was tied back neatly, a stark contrast to his pale, unwrinkled face. His eyes were bright and sharp, eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much. And his hands, just as Adrien had imagined, were covered in white silk gloves. "Count Alaric?" Adrien whispered, his voice lost in the vastness of the hall. "The very same," the Count smiled, a smile that touched his lips but not his eyes. "I am pleased you accepted my invitation. The journey must have been tiring." Not really, sir," Adrien stammered, trying to maintain his composure. "Your estate is truly impressive." "It is merely a relic of the past," Count Alaric said with a slight wave of his hand. But I did not invite you here to admire old stones. Our masterpiece awaits. This way, please." With that, the Count turned and began to walk, his steps light and soundless. He needed no candle, but it seemed the candles along the corridor lit up as he approached and extinguished as soon as he passed, leaving Adrien to hurry after him into an ever-darkening and deepening hallway. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly. Portraits of the Montfort ancestors hung on the walls, their eyes painted with such unnerving life that they seemed to follow Adrien silently as he passed. The air grew colder, and Adrien felt as if he were descending into the heart of an ancient tomb. Finally, the Count stopped before a pair of walnut double doors. Unlike the rough main door, this one was intricately carved with images of angels playing harps and lyres, but their faces were contorted in expressions of extreme agony. Count Alaric gently pushed the doors open without a sound. They entered the music room. It was a breathtakingly magnificent room, but it also bore an undeniable air of mourning. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by marble columns. A colossal stained glass window took up most of the far wall, but the only light that filtered through was the weak gray blue of a new moon through clouds and fog. Everything in the room was covered in a thin layer of dust, a testament to the passage of time. Everything except for one thing. In the very center of the room, on a small wooden platform, was a grand piano. It was made of polished ebony, reflecting the dim candlelight like the surface of a lake at night. Its surface was perfectly clean, without a single speck of dust, standing out bizarrely amidst the surrounding decay. The piano looked less like a musical instrument and more like an altar or a luxurious coffin. "This is where you will work," Count Alaric said, his voice echoing in the still space. "Everything you need is here." The Count walked to the piano, placing the leather satchel he had been carrying on its lid. Adrien hadn't even noticed him carrying it. With an almost reverent gesture, he opened the satchel and took out a large manuscript bound in cracked black leather. "Lacrimosa immortalis," the Count whispered, placing the manuscript on the music stand. Adrien stepped forward, the curiosity of an artist overpowering his fear. He looked at the thick, time-yellowed parchment pages, and then he saw it. The notes, the staves, all were written in a dark, reddish-brown ink, a strange, unnatural color. In the thicker parts, it was almost the color of dried blood. "A special ink," the Count said, seeming to read Adrien's thoughts, "to ensure the work will last." Adrien pushed his unease aside, focusing on his craft. He scanned the first few bars. The opening melody was magnificent. It was lyrical, tragic, carrying a profound and heart-wrenching beauty. He could hear the melody in his head, a dirge for a fallen angel. The artist's heart within him stirred. He understood the sentiment the composer had poured into it. But as he turned to the next pages, his brow began to furrow. The music became strange. The initially harmonious melody began to be broken by dissonant chords, by unusual intervals that went against every rule of harmony he had ever learned. The rhythm became disjointed, chaotic. Towards the end, it no longer resembled a symphony, but rather a transcription of madness, a jumble of chaotic sounds thrown together in desperation. "It's strange," Adrien blurted out. "The beginning is as if written by a genius, but the latter part, my lord, it is full of errors. The structure is broken. It is unfinished," Count Alaric interrupted, a strange glint in his eyes. "It does not need to be fixed, Monsieur Valois. It needs to be understood. It demands of the musician not just skill, but a piece of their very soul to fill the empty spaces. That is why I chose you." Adrien's professional pride surged. He looked at the chaotic jumble of notes, not with fear, but with the confidence of an expert. He saw it as a challenge, a work from a great mind that lacked formal technique. And he, Adrien Valois, would be the one to bring order to this chaos, to tame this wild beast and turn it into a true masterpiece. "I understand," Adrien said, his voice full of determination. "It is a great challenge, but I believe I can do it." But the work was not easy. The music seemed to have a life of its own, a will of its own. Every time Adrien corrected a dissonant passage, another would become more jarring. Every time he tried to impose a lyrical melody, the music seemed to writhe and slither back to its original, morbid form. It felt less like composing and more like fighting a living entity. He began to work mostly at night. During the day, the weak sunlight filtering through the stained glass irritated his eyes. Only when night fell, when the estate was plunged into absolute silence, did he feel he could truly hear the music. He sat at the glossy black piano with only candles for light, his shadows stretching across the floor, dancing with his every movement. The more he played, the more he felt an unusual fatigue, an exhaustion that was not merely physical. It was as if something was being drawn out of him, bit by bit, through his fingertips each time they touched the keys. After every night of work, he would return to his room, his body heavy as lead, but his mind taut as a string. Sleep no longer brought rest, only plunging him into vague nightmares filled with disjointed melodies and endless dark corridors. He lost weight, his skin grew pale, and dark circles formed under his eyes. He barely touched the sumptuous meals that a mute maidservant silently left outside his door each day. The only hunger he felt was the hunger to complete the music. One night, while struggling to rewrite a climactic passage, Adrien felt utterly stuck. He crumpled up the manuscript paper, threw it on the floor in frustration, and buried his head on the keyboard. A cacophony of notes rang out, a jarring sound of failure. "No, it's impossible," he muttered. He wearily closed his eyes, just for a moment. He only meant to rest for a moment. When he opened his eyes, the candles had burned almost to their stubs, wax dripping down the holders. He didn't know how long he had been asleep. The room was bone-chillingly cold. He rubbed his eyes, and then he saw it. The crumpled manuscript paper he had thrown on the floor was now lying neatly on the music stand, smoothed out. And on it, the passage he had been stuck on was now complete. The notes were written in the same reddish-brown ink, the handwriting elegant and perfect, identical to his own. Adrien froze, his heart pounding. He had no memory of writing it. He couldn't possibly have written it in his sleep. He looked around. The room was empty. The door was still shut tight. There was only him and the piano. With a trembling hand, he reached out and played the newly appeared notes. The melody rang out, horrifyingly perfect. It was the missing link, the answer he had been searching for all night. But it hadn't come from him. It had come from somewhere else. After that night, Adrien worked with a sense of both compulsion and terror. He no longer tried to fix the music. Instead, he let it guide him. Sometimes he would sit for hours before the piano, not writing, not playing, just listening. He listened to the silence of the room, and in that silence, melodies and chords would arise in his mind, as if someone were whispering them into his ear. The work progressed at an alarming rate. The symphony was taking shape, growing more complex and majestic, but also darker and more morbid. Adrien felt he was no longer a composer, but a medium, a vessel for translating an ancient and terrible language into music. At the same time, the Montfort estate began to speak to him. It started with sounds. As he walked along the deserted corridors, he could have sworn he heard the rustle of a silk dress behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing. Sometimes, from a closed room, he would hear the faint sound of a woman sobbing. But when he pressed his ear to the door, there was only silence. Then came the images. He began to see figures in the corners of his eyes. A black shadow gliding down the end of a corridor. A gaunt, pale face flickering in a dusty mirror before vanishing. He told himself it was just exhaustion, that the flickering candlelight was creating illusions. But they became clearer and clearer. One night, while playing the piano, he felt a cold draft on the back of his neck, though the windows and doors were all closed. He looked at the glossy black surface of the piano, and for a second, his own reflection was replaced. He saw a young woman with terrified eyes sitting in his place, her fingers flying across the keys, and behind her, the shadow of Count Alaric loomed, enveloping her like a giant spider. The image shattered instantly, leaving only his own pale face staring back at him. The nightmares worsened. They were no longer about endless corridors. Now he dreamed of himself. He dreamed he was playing Lacrimosa Immortalis to an empty concert hall. He played on and on, his fingers bleeding, exhausted, but he couldn't stop. The demonic melody poured out, draining his soul, while in the front row, Count Alaric sat, applauding slowly, a satisfied smile on his face. He would wake up from these dreams drenched in a cold sweat, the music still ringing in his ears. The line between dream and reality, between music and silence, was slowly dissolving. Adrien tried to find a rational explanation. He rummaged through the estate's vast library, a place the Count never seemed to enter. He hoped to find a medical book about hallucinations caused by exhaustion, or perhaps a local's diary. Most of the books were ancient volumes of poetry or tedious philosophical treatises. But then, in the darkest, dampest corner of the library, he found something he had not been looking for. It was not a book. It was a stack of old portraits, hastily painted on small canvases, hidden behind a wobbly bookshelf. The first was of a man in his 40s with a full beard, dressed as a Florentine painter. The second was a young woman with golden hair holding a violin. The third was an old man with sharp eyes surrounded by alchemical instruments. There were 5 portraits in total. They all had one thing in common. Their eyes were wide with an unspeakable terror. And inside, carefully wrapped in a discolored linen cloth, was a small, leather-bound diary. Adrien picked it up with trembling hands. There was no name on the cover. He opened the first page. A woman's elegant script appeared. Julian de Mornay, June 1768. This was it. Tap, tap, tap. Adrien froze. A steady, cold sound echoed from the far end of the corridor. The sound of Count Alaric's cane on the stone floor. He was coming. There was no time to read carefully. In a panic, Adrien flipped through the pages, his eyes devouring the words frantically, trying to piece together the horrific truth hidden within them. June 12th. The music is extraordinary, a challenge worthy of my talent. The Count is a learned man, if a bit eccentric. He says my music will become immortal. The handwriting was full of hope, just like him at the beginning. He flipped further. June 28th. I am so tired. Sleep brings no peace. It feels as if the piano is draining my strength. Last night, I saw him in the mirror, the painter from Florence. He looked terrifying. Adrien's heart clenched. She had seen the apparitions too. He flipped towards the end. The handwriting was now a scrawl, shaky, the ink smudged as if by tears. July 15th. It's not music. I understand now. It's a cage, a ritual. He doesn't listen to the music. He eats it. He eats our lives with every note. The symphony is the knife, and we are the sacrifice. The red ink. God, the red ink is... The sentence was cut off abruptly. The tapping of the cane had stopped, right outside the library door. Adrien frantically turned to the last page. Only a few words were hastily written, the script scratching the paper like a silent scream. Burn it! Destroy the music before it is complete. Do not let him take your melody. The brass doorknob began to turn. Without thinking, Adrien shoved the diary into his coat, replaced the floorboard, and dove into a dark corner hidden behind an old curtain. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The library door slowly swung open. Count Alaric's shadow stretched across the floor. He stood at the threshold for a moment, silent as a predator sensing its prey. Adrien could feel his gaze sweeping the room, piercing through the thin curtain where he hid. A second felt like an eternity. Then, with a chillingly casual air, the Count stepped back and closed the door. The footsteps and the tapping of the cane resumed, growing fainter and fainter, then fell silent. Adrien collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, a cold sweat drenching his body. He was safe, but only just. Julian's warning echoed in his head, no longer a mystery, but a death sentence. The Symphony Lacrimosa Immortalis was almost complete, and he was its final note, fleeing the melody of death. The silence of the room was now more terrifying than any sound. Adrien no longer heard the whispers or the ghostly footsteps. Perhaps it was because he now knew where they came from. They were the echoes of trapped souls, victims devoured by the symphony. He was next. His initial fear was slowly being replaced by a cold clarity. All the pieces now fit together. The crushing fatigue, the apparitions, the music that completed itself, and the reddish-brown ink. He shuddered at the thought. It wasn't ink, it was blood, the life essence of those who came before, used to write the sentence for the one to come next. Count Alaric was no art-loving nobleman. He was a parasite, an ancient monster who used music as a tool to steal life, to prolong his own unnatural existence. Lacrimosa immortalis, immortal tears. Now he understood the name. The Count's immortality was paid for with the tears and lives of people like him. Burn it! Destroy the music before it is complete! Julian's warning echoed in Adrien's mind. It was the only way. He couldn't escape. The estate was a trap, and the surrounding forest was the monster's domain. He couldn't fight him with force either, but he could destroy his weapon. He had to get to the music room and throw the manuscript into the fireplace. Adrien stood up, a fire of determination igniting in his weary eyes. He would not die like a lamb led to the slaughter. He would fight. He would end this curse. He looked around the room, searching for something he could use as a weapon, if only to reassure himself. A heavy iron candlestick. He gripped it, feeling its cold weight in his hand. The plan was clear. Wait until just before dawn, when the estate was at its quietest, and sneak to the music room. He would destroy the music, and perhaps the demonic piano as well. Then he would try to escape in the chaos. Adrien stood up, a fire of determination igniting in his weary eyes. He would not die like a lamb led to the slaughter. He would fight. He would end this curse. He looked around the room, searching for something he could use as a weapon, if only to reassure himself. A heavy iron candlestick. He gripped it, feeling its cold weight in his hand. The plan was clear. Wait until just before dawn, when the estate was at its quietest, and sneak to the music room. He would destroy the music, and perhaps the demonic piano as well. Then he would try to escape in the chaos. Two gentle but firm knocks on the door, sharp as a knife stabbing the silence. Adrien froze in place. He held his breath, clutching the candlestick. Monsieur Valois, Count Alaric's voice came from outside, still smooth, but now carrying an undeniable urgency. I know you are awake. Do not waste any more time. Silence. Adrien didn't answer. The symphony awaits, the Count's voice continued, this time sounding as if it were right next to the door. It is nearly complete. It needs only one final chord, a chord that only you can write. It is calling to you, Adrien. For the first time, he used his given name. No longer the formal Monsieur Valois. Now it was a claim of ownership. Feeling he could no longer hide, Adrien took a deep breath. I need to rest. We will continue in the morning. A low, cold laugh came from behind the door. No, it must be tonight, when the veil between worlds is at its thinnest, when the music holds the greatest power. The lock on the door made a small sound, and then the doorknob slowly turned. Adrien had forgotten one thing. This was the Count's castle. The lock only had meaning for him. The door opened. Count Alaric stood there, his face terrifyingly calm in the candlelight from the hallway. He didn't look at the candlestick Adrien was holding. His eyes were fixed on Adrien, a piercing, powerful gaze. "It is time, my composer. Come and place the final note for our immortality." Adrien's plan had vanished into thin air. He was cornered. There was no retreat. The inevitable confrontation had arrived. He had only one weapon left, not the candlestick in his hand, but his own musical knowledge and creativity. "Sit," Count Alaric commanded, his voice now stripped of all pretense. It was cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Finish it." Adrien sat down, the ivory keys as cold as human bone beneath his fingers. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the piano, from the music sheet before him. The air in the room grew thick, as if the very ghosts of the previous victims were gathering, holding their breath in anticipation. Under the Count's hypnotic gaze, Adrien's hands began to move. He began to play. The melody of Lacrimosa Immortalis poured out, filling the room. It was magnificent, tragic, and utterly evil. With each note that sounded, Adrien felt a piece of his life force being drawn out, sucked into the piano, into the music, and then transferred to the Count, who stood absorbing it with a look of pure satisfaction. The flames of the surrounding candles flared violently, dancing madly, and the shadows on the walls writhed like souls in agony. He played through the familiar passages, the melodies that had haunted him in his sleep. He felt his body grow light, his mind hazy. He was dying. And then he reached the final passage, the empty space on the page, the final chord of the symphony, the final note of his life. Count Alaric leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "It is here. Write, my composer. Offer your melody. Complete our masterpiece." In that moment, as his life flickered, Julian's warning rang in his head, clearer than ever. "Do not let him take your melody." My melody. No, he could take his life, but he could not take his music. Music was the only thing that was truly his. It was his father's legacy. It was his soul. A new strength, the strength of despair and pride, surged within Adrien. His fingers, instead of playing the chord the music demanded, began to play something entirely different. A new melody rang out. It was not melancholic and dark. It was pure, simple, and filled with a gentle but resilient sorrow. It was the opening notes of the sonata he had written for his late father, his own melody. Count Alaric was stunned. "What are you doing? That is not the music. Play it correctly." But Adrien no longer heard him. He was lost in his own music. He used his pure melody to directly confront the dark theme of Lacrimosa. A musical battle erupted. Adrien's hopeful major chords fought against the symphony's mournful minor chords. His bright, fast arpeggios shattered the slow, deathly rhythms of the curse. "Stop!" the Count roared. But it was too late. The ritual had been broken and reversed. The life energy he had accumulated for centuries now had no escape, and it began to tear its host's body apart from the inside. But his destruction was not a simple death. As the magical link between him and the music shattered, a horrific psychic backlash occurred. The dark energy, instead of dissipating, sought the nearest remaining host, Adrien. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Adrien's mind was torn apart. He was no longer in the music room. He was falling into an abyss of memories. He saw himself standing on the streets of 16th century Paris, then lost in a bloody battlefield in Germany, then in a cluttered alchemist's laboratory. He saw faces, dozens, hundreds of faces of the previous victims. He saw Julian sobbing at the piano, saw the Florentine painter screaming as his paints turned to blood, saw the alchemist immolating himself in his lab. He didn't just see, he felt their pain, their despair, and their madness. And at the center of this storm of memories was Count Alaric. Adrien saw his true nature, an ancient, hungry entity, not human, a parasite that survived by stealing and consuming what humans treasured most, their creativity, the melody of their souls. At the same time, in reality, the Count's body was convulsing and deforming. A hideous transformation began to take place. His flesh bubbled like wax, wrinkling and sagging, revealing an ancient skeletal form beneath. He looked up at Adrien, and in his eyes, Adrien saw an ocean of pure hatred and malice. "If I must die," a polyphonic voice, composed of his and hundreds of other victims' voices, echoed in Adrien's mind, "then you will carry my legacy." With his final breath, the Count did not let out a scream of pain. He did something far more terrible. He sang. He sang the opening notes of Lacrimosa Immortalis. A raw melody, without instruments, emerged from a disintegrating throat. It was not music. It was a final curse, an acoustic parasite fired directly into Adrien's mind. Then his body dissolved into a cloud of black dust and bone fragments. Simultaneously, the stained glass window shattered. The entire estate groaned and began to collapse. The Count's final curse pulled Adrien from the psychic shock. He snapped back to reality, finding himself in the middle of a terrestrial hell. He didn't think, he acted on pure survival instinct. He bolted from the music room, running down the cracking corridors. Portraits fell from the walls, suits of armor toppled over. The floor shook beneath his feet. He ran, not just to escape the rubble. He ran to escape the melody that had just been carved into his brain. He kicked open the main door and burst out into the cold night air, just as the tallest spire of the estate collapsed with a deafening roar. He didn't dare look back. He just kept running, deep into the forest, ignoring the branches that scratched his face. He ran until he was exhausted and collapsed in the clearing. Dawn was breaking in the east, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the leaves. The air was fresh. Birds began to sing. He had survived. He was free. Adrien shakily got to his feet, leaning against a tree. He closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of life. But then, mixed with the bird song, he heard it. A faint, sad, and wrong piano melody. It wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from inside his own head. The melody of Lacrimosa Immortalis. He had destroyed the manuscript. He had killed the monster. But the Count had won in another way. He had turned Adrien into the last living prison for his work. Adrien opened his eyes, looking at the dawn. Tears streamed down his cheeks again. He had been saved, but he was also eternally cursed. The symphony was well and truly over, but its melody would never let him go. And so our chapter for tonight comes to a close. Our characters once again stand before daunting challenges, and the light of hope, however faint, has never been extinguished. They will need to rest to prepare for the battle ahead, just as we do. As each day passes, perhaps every one of us faces our own battles. There are times of exhaustion, times of uncertainty amidst the darkness of worries and sorrows. But you see, just as Pan found the light within himself, the night is not always something to be feared. It is the necessary silence for us to recover, to heal, and to let beautiful dreams lead the way. Thank you for listening and for joining the Dark Hour today. If the story touched you, please leave a like to spread this light. And don't forget to subscribe so we don't lose each other in the next chapter. For now, let go of all your worries. I wish you a deep sleep and truly peaceful dreams. Good night.